Thanks so much for joining our webinar about ADHD in the digital industry in support of ADHD Awareness Month, which is October. For those who don't know me, because there's actually a lot on the call who I do know, so it's nice to see some familiar faces, but my name is Ani Møller. I'm autistic and ADHD myself, and I am a business transformation consultant and also a neurodivergent coach here in Melbourne, Australia. And my pronouns are she, they. I'll pass over to you, Julia.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to have you all here. My name is Julia Birks. I'm the head of digital design at Maya. I'm an ADHD, genderqueer, gender non-conforming woman. My pronouns are she, they. And I'm just a nerd for human-centered design. I'm based in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia.
So I did already mention this, and it's already, maybe you can already see it in the chat, but I'm going to say it again. So if you do have any questions or particular topics that you're hoping that we're going to cover today, please post that in the chat. If you've got any questions along the way, post away. We will have a Q&A at the end, and so we'll aim to cover all of that off. There is also a lot to talk about today because this is a really big topic. So we may not get to everything, and if we don't, we may do another webinar on something in particular that you find interesting. So in terms of meeting hygiene, you guys are already doing an amazing job, so thank you. Please mute yourself if you haven't already. Feel free to have your video on or off, whatever is more comfortable for you. It is nice to see some faces, so it doesn't feel like we're talking into the wind. So yes, thank you. And also, just so that you're aware, you probably would have seen the little notification at the top, but we are recording today. So just be cautious about any information that you might share in the chat or any questions, just in case there's anything personal that you wouldn't want to be on a recording. And also, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today. So we obviously need to start with a little bit of overview of what is ADHD, because it is really not very well understood, and it's also really frequently misdiagnosed or undiagnosed. So I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview, which I'm going to read off because I forget this stuff. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a genetic neurodevelopmental condition that has a broad range of conditions. It's a biological condition that affects dopamine and blood flow in the prefrontal cortex, and it's not a behavior condition. It largely affects what are called the executive functions, which we'll talk a little bit about today. These include working memory, impulse control, planning and prioritization, task initiation, organization, flexible thinking, emotional control, and self-monitoring. There are 3 types of ADHD: hyperactive type, which is probably the one that people know the most of, inattentive type, and combined type, which is a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. And with some of the challenges of ADHD, there are a whole bunch of strengths, which is why we're talking about this in the context of digital, because these strengths are what makes us us and what makes us awesome at our jobs. Things like creativity, out-of-the-box thinking, spontaneity, passion, fast work pace, ideas machines. So some key stats. In Australia, current stats are that there are 1 in 20 people who have ADHD. It is also estimated that around 85% of people who have ADHD are not diagnosed, so they do not get a diagnosis. My estimates are probably that there may be as many as 1 in 10 people with ADHD. And when you start to look at organizations or industries like digital, that's where we tend to cluster. And in some teams that I've seen, it's very likely that every person in that team is ADHD, and we just don't know. There is also another stat that says that around 1 in 7 or even 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent. So well, there's a few terms we'll be talking about today. So neurotypical, that is how the average brain works. Neurodivergent is just a brain that works a little bit differently. And neurodiversity is all brains. So let's start with a little bit about ADHD. So I think it's really common, there are a lot of stereotypes around ADHD, which is traditionally the hyperactive white male child.
Yeah, Annie, I wanted to just call out something that you spoke about earlier, and you talked about this thing that, you know, ADHD isn't a behavioral problem, you know, and I think when you're looking at the stuff at the top of the iceberg here that Annie's going to go through, that's usually in the past how people got diagnosed, because they were displaying these symptoms. And the big thing we're going to unpack today is it's actually much deeper than that. There's much more to it, and the behavioral aspect is a manifestation of ADHD not kind of being effectively supported usually. So yeah.
Yeah, you said something when we were preparing for this, which was that people tend to be diagnosed with ADHD when their symptoms, I can't remember what the exact words that you used.
It's basically what you saw in the past was people getting an ADHD diagnosis when their actions, their behaviors were inconvenient to others, typically neurotypical people, right? So I remember there were a bunch of boys I went to primary school with who all had ADHD diagnoses, and they were the inverted commas bad boys who were disruptive and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, those of us who were struggling with interrupting in class and getting chastised just kind of not even understood that was a thing. So
yeah. And I think there's a lot of aspects to ADHD that are, you know, often not understood, which if we start to look at the bottom part of this iceberg, things like perfectionism, really, really common, imposter syndrome, you know, time blindness to things that don't have deadlines, or even when they do have a deadline, leaving things to the last minute, and that often causing a lot of anxiety. Either being disorganized or hyper organized. So I'm a hyper organized person because I developed systems to manage my ADHD that I didn't even know that I had. What are some of the things in the iceberg here that you relate with, Julia?
Look, I mean, just a lot, really. The biggest thing for me prior to my diagnosis was really, as I matured in my career, understanding that my depression and anxiety were likely very, very intricately related to undiagnosed ADHD. And I think it actually took me quite a while down my understanding of my neurotype to sort of accept that they were really likely, you know, caused by untreated ADHD. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes with that. But mate, difficulty receiving feedback.
Huge one.
Oh, I feel so sorry for all my line managers, you know, prior to a certain point in time, where, you know, I used to get really frustrated with myself because I would just often get constructive feedback and I would just immediately cry. And it was interesting because in my brain, I was like, you don't need to cry. Yeah, I'm seeing some meme comments come through the chat and I'm like, yeah, it's relatable. You know, because so there's an interesting stat, Annie, you will, being the Google wizard that you are, this is one of Annie's superpowers. You will probably know the number, but what's the percentage of feedback difference that ADHD folks have by the age
stat
it is?
So by the time an ADHD child is 12 years old, they would have received 20,000 more pieces of negative feedback than a 12-year-old child who does not have ADHD. So there's a lot of discussion in the community around that feedback thing, which is actually called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, about that actually being a trauma response to all of these, you know, by the time you get to like your 40s, hundreds of thousands of pieces of negative feedback that you have heard all through your life, some small things, some things that may feel bigger. And it can be quite overwhelming, and it kind of, looking at this one here around low self-esteem, like that really feeds into the low self-esteem and the imposter syndrome, because you're just constantly being reminded of all of your deficits, which is something I wanted to mention around the name of ADHD, which is really like not a good name, because people with ADHD,
very ableist name, isn't it, Annie? Very ableist.
Very ableist. People with ADHD don't have a deficit of attention. They have difficulty in regulating their attention, particularly on things that we don't find interesting.
Annie, what about this iceberg really stands out for you? Because I know you got you self-diagnosed as autistic prior to getting an ADHD diagnosis, right?
Yeah. So autism came first. That was rough for me going through that process. So by the time I got ADHD, I was like, yeah, okay, makes sense. Cool, move on. But a lot of the things in here, like I just had no idea that this was ADHD. So for me, zoning out during conversations, like people would talk to me and I would just be off in my own world, just thinking about other things. And it wasn't always that I found the conversations boring. I just couldn't focus on the conversation. So that one, also the constant internal monologue. So I know that is what my misdiagnosis of anxiety was, because we should talk about like the 3 types. So which type are you? Which type were you diagnosed with?
It's so funny. I never actually got told which type I am, but I do think I'm combined, because I'm definitely not only inattentive. And as you all see in a few slides time, there's just some interesting conversations to be had about hyperactivity, aren't there, Annie, in me?
Yes. Yeah. So my hyperactivity was in my mind.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was the misdiagnosis of anxiety.
Yeah. Like I think there's so many things here. And, one of the reasons we wanted to have this webinar is that, like, I really distinctly remember a moment like maybe 5 or 6 years ago when I was working with one of my besties at a digital agency, and she was great. And like, I sort of helped her get hired into the company, and she's an awesome human, but she just seemed to find, like, we were about the same level of experience. She's a little bit younger than me, but we just seemed to find, like, we'll have totally different experiences of the same thing, like in such a crazy disproportionate way, and things that to her felt seemed very effortless, and she didn't have to think too hard about managing. We would talk about this and I'd be like, that is just so hard for me. Like I was retelling a story yesterday to, I think it was you, Annie, actually, about how I used to describe when our account managers and project managers would come in and try to interrupt me when I was in flow. And so I was leading like multiple projects and had a bunch of different, experienced designers reporting into me. And, so I was constantly task switching. And every time I needed to concentrate, it felt like I had to do like 100 push-ups in my brain. Like, that's how hard it was, like how physically exhausting it was to take the thing that I'd been interrupted with and be like, okay, now I need to go back to this detailed design work and figure that out. And I just couldn't understand why that was so hard for me, and like what was wrong with me, and why could everyone else leave work on time and finish stuff efficiently. And I just felt like if I had those interruptions, I just couldn't get it done. So
yeah. You mentioned the concept of flow, which is something I've actually been thinking a lot about recently. And I wonder if what we're talking about when we talk about flow is actually ADHD hyperfocus.
Weird.
Yeah, because I don't know, have you ever gotten in, as an ADHD, have you ever gotten into flow on something that you find boring?
I have, but it's like I probably would have spent 4 hours to get into, like, to get focused on it. My mum used to have this really good trick when I was a kid and I didn't want to do assignments, which was pretty much every time. And it would come to like the night before the assignment and I'd be due and I wouldn't have even picked a topic. And so mum would sit me down at the kitchen table, and it's so funny. It's like, lol, how did anyone not realize I was ADHD? But I'd be like, I'm just going to get a glass of water. And my mum would say, no, Julia, sit down. I'll get the water. What's the title? What's the title page going to be? Why don't you just start with the title page? Yeah. And so it was kind of learning those like little incremental things to get started. But that would literally take me hours. It was awful.
So how did you come to your diagnosis? Because yours is still fairly recent. You were diagnosed in adulthood, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Yeah. So I got diagnosed about 3 years ago. It'll be just about my 3-year anniversary now, actually. So my wife, hello, can you mute that person, please? Heather. Oh, thank you, Heather. Sorry. I got very distracted there. So my wife started looking into autism about probably like 8 years ago. And, you know, in a very scientific way, of course, we went on the internet and did some quizzes. And because she was doing it, I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do a quiz. And it turned out to be like a combined like neurodiversity quiz. And the quiz said to her, yeah, lol, you're probs autistic. And the quiz for me said, yeah, you've probably got ADHD. And I was like, I don't have ADHD. What do you mean? And like, I remember thinking that was so funny that this quiz had said to me like, yeah, you've got ADHD, because my only understanding of that was this really negative stereotype that exists, this very oversimplified view of ADHD. So yeah, I kind of kept it as a little fact in my mind, and then just sort of started introducing things over time that like, oh yeah, well, if fidgeting helps ADHD people, like I might not be ADHD, but let's see if fidgeting works. And turned out fidgeting worked really well for helping me concentrate in client meetings. And kind of went from there. And then a couple of years ago, I tried to get a diagnosis. And my GP initially said, oh, well, why would you want to get a diagnosis? And it sort of put me off a bit. And this is probably a really key one for us to talk about, isn't it, Annie? Like lots of healthcare barriers to getting a diagnosis.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was diagnosed during the pandemic, unsurprisingly, and was actually really diagnosed by TikTok. Previous to that, I would never thought that I had ADHD. And in fact, even after I was diagnosed twice, once by a psychologist and once by a psychiatrist, and sometimes even now, I'm still like, I don't really have ADHD, surely. Like, surely I'm actually just lazy, stupid, and useless, which is really not great self-talk to have.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that comes down to just the stereotypes of, you know, the hyperactive person. Like my hyperactivity or impulsivity is internalized, or it's when I'm talking. It's not like I'm not running around because I'm autistic. I'm tired all the time.
Yeah, and Annie, someone's really a person named Anarchy has just popped something in the post in the chat. It says, even if you had the classic hyperactive disruptive symptoms and spent most of your schooling in timeout with the ADHD boys, you still didn't get a diagnosis if you were a girl doing really well academically, because there was this belief that you can't be gifted or ADHD.
Yes. Tell me what your psychiatrist told you when you got diagnosed.
I really love my psychiatrist. He's you know, got some pros and some cons, but he's overall a bloody good human. And the first time I sat down with him, like I'd done all the forms and like written everything. I got my mum to write a letter for my diagnosis and all that kind of thing, my report cards, and he read through it all. And he said, you know, we went for about 20-30 minutes, and he sort of said, oh yeah, Julia, there's no doubt in my mind that you have ADHD. And I was like, oh good, like that means a lot, because I was really freaking out. And we kept talking, and at the end of the session, you know, because I've been talking to him about my career path, and at this point I was, I think, a lead or I was an associate director of service design by this point, or strategic design. And at the very end of the session, he said, oh, Julia, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I've never met someone with ADHD who's just so successful. And like, I was just, I mean, that was really nice, because I didn't always get compliments for being successful. But at the same time, like taking that away and thinking about that, I was just like, that's fucking nuts. And
yeah.
when you look at some of the data about ADHD in Australia, like I think a year or two ago, and Annie and I did a different presentation on this, one of the most, like the easiest to find bits of data was about ADHD and criminal offending and all that kind of stuff. It's like the science has really kind of barely scratched the surface in terms of the spectrum of how, or the gamut of different, the diverse ways in which ADHD is expressed. So yeah, it's sort of really, it's one of the hard things I think about getting that diagnosis is that, you know, there's this perception that you can't be successful and ADHD. Whereas Annie, like, what's your experience been of, because you're quite successful, and I know your ADHD has created a lot of challenges for you in your career as well.
Yeah, like it was literally the source of all of my anxiety, mostly because I was so good at masking my ADHD symptoms. And in many ways, my ADHD made me really good at my job. So I was a project manager, project director at a digital agency, and I thrived on the chaos. It gave me all of those dopamine feels that I needed. There were lots of other ADHDers around me who, we would have great conversations, we'd brainstorm, get all excited, what I like to call brain fizzing. And so it made me good at things, but I was masking my symptoms so much that I would work late into the night all the time. I was often working weekends. I was almost always the last person to leave the office. Mm-hmm. And that was less around my ability to like meet deadlines and what have you, and more around my imposter syndrome. So I was actually a gifted child. I was put into a gifted class in high school, but I also didn't finish high school because my ADHD wouldn't let me choose a topic for my final portfolio of photography, and I just didn't do it in the end at all. So I didn't finish high school. And when I go back and look at my reports, they all said pretty much the same thing. It was either in a class that I liked, Andrea, that's my name. Andrea is a gifted student. She's so well behaved. On the other side, it was like, Andrea is frequently late. She needs to make more effort. She is not meeting her full potential. And that is something that's really common to see in the report cards of ADHD, is not meeting full potential, being late, trouble focusing, distracting other people in the class. So yeah, now I want to move on because I'm very conscious of time. But there are a number of kind of aspects of executive function that ADHDers are impacted with.
Hey, Annie, what's executive dysfunction?
Oh, good question. I don't think I have a perfect response to that, but the executive functions are really what help you to do basic tasks in life. And when you have executive dysfunction, it means those functions aren't working as per a typical person. And so there's often mentions of things like working memory. So that's your ability to retain information in your mind and keep it there. I have no memory at all, unless it is about one of my autistic special interests or something that I am hyper focusing on and learning all of the facts on. So I want to go to this next slide, which shows the differences between me and you, because ADHD is a spectrum condition, and every ADHD can be very different to another person, which is why even after you were diagnosed and we were working together really closely, I could not recognize your ADHD in myself.
Yeah. It's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because like when we were doing this for this webinar, like I was quite fascinated by how much overlap. Like I don't know what it was in my brain, but my brain assumed that our ADHD would have manifested quite differently. Yeah, I mean, the biggest one for me, I think that I really struggle with in terms of executive dysfunction is just that initiation. Like, you know, that was always my problem, you know, back to the story of me at the kitchen table, my mum basically trying to remove every possible distraction to stop me from writing the title page. And then once I'd written the title page, I'd like literally just hyper focus through. And so I think that for me is like, you know, a really, really interesting dynamic in that the initiation for me is like so hard that like when we were drawing this up, I said to Annie, like, I really think mine needs to go beyond the chart because it's just, that's the hardest part for me. And even on things I want to do sometimes as well. Like I want to paint, but I just struggle to initiate sitting down and stopping my brain enough to paint or to read a book or whatever. But yeah, sustaining effort. Once I've gotten into the task, I can sustain effort just in crazy hyper focus to extents where my wife is like, it's 11 o'clock, babe, you need to go to sleep. Like it's time, like you've been doing this for like 13 hours. You haven't had lunch. You like it can get quite extreme. Whereas you're a little bit, I guess, different in terms of, you find that initiation a little bit easier, like slightly easier, don't you, Annie?
Slightly easier, but it's still extreme. But it also depends on what the task is. So ADHD brains are interest-based brains. So if it's something that I'm really interested or excited about doing, like I'll just do it straight away. I'll drop everything else that's important and just do this thing that's just going to make me feel really awesome doing it. So things like folding away my laundry, not going to happen because I don't want to do that. I'm not interested in it. But yeah, I think on this one, like my issues have always been like probably struggling with, like I said, my memory, emotional regulation. Like my rejection sensitivity dysphoria is not great. It's pretty bad. It's better than it used to be after many years of cognitive behavioral therapy. But yes, it is a spectrum, and it can look different in everyone else. And I think in some ways, when we work together, we complement each other, even though these wheels may not reflect that perfectly. But some of our skills are complementary.
Yeah, oh, very much so. And I think it's also one of those aspects of, for yourself, Annie, also having like pretty archetypal, that's such a bad stereotype. So I'm even ableist sometimes, having autism as well, and the way that your autism manifests often offsets my ADHD, I think, as well. I know you were talking a bit about that earlier.
Yeah, they're in conflict, but they also support each other. So I have, like my ADHD makes me, I don't know, a little bit disorganized, but as an autistic child, I love nothing more than to line my toys up and organize them by color. So that made me good at my job. Now I want to talk about strengths. I think this is really important for.
Can we just go back a bit? Sorry, we just got lots of questions coming through. So firstly, I just wanted to address a couple of them. So Alira had asked, keen to hear some tips on how to support those who display these behaviors. We've got you covered, coming soon. And then, so Shu had asked, if you can just go back to the wheel, Annie. Shuyen had asked, these items on the wheels are inverse, are they? As a high score at initiation is a lot of problems in initiating tasks. Yeah, that's correct. So we kind of debated over in tackling this wheel, whether to kind of look at it through the perspective of, positive framing or negative framing and getting the consistency right. And so we kind of tackled it from a diagnosis perspective, which is the higher you are on these scales, like typically the more likely it is that you have ADHD, or if you have enough of them. So Annie, do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of like, we've all had that experience, or maybe not all of us, but a lot of us would have had that experience of like, you tell someone you think you're ADHD and they say, oh, well, isn't everybody a little bit ADHD though?
My experience is the people who tend to say that actually have ADHD. They just don't know yet. So it's the clustering of the symptoms that is important for an ADHD diagnosis, and they must be present from childhood. But yeah, generally people say that when they think everyone shares the same experience as them, but the same experience that is with other ADHDers. So I want to move on to strengths. I'm aware it's already 1:30. So I think in terms of digital, when we look at kind of strengths, I know this is another iceberg. Who doesn't love an iceberg? But this to me really shows why there are so many ADHDers working in digital, particularly in design. Creativity is basically what's the word? It's a byproduct of having ADHD. It's what makes us us.
Yeah. Pattern recognition, like creative problem solving, connecting things, like finding strange ways that unexpected things fit together. We're awesome at that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from you, like your experience, working in a design team with ADHD. What is that like? How does that benefit you?
Well, there's a lot of benefits, right? Because in human-centered design, experience design, UX, service design, whatever cool name you want to call it, a lot of us are really, really good at riffing off each other, I think, because I'd say a significant proportion of us are neurodivergent, and an even more significant proportion of us are ADHD. And so I've found that the benefits are that, we because we love a good rabbit hole, we love a good deep dive or a hyper focus into a topic that we really find curious. We're natural researchers, so that's been a real benefit for me in my work. We're great when you need to sit down and come up with a bunch of different ideas. The only catch is that when it comes to executing those ideas and sustaining that attention and seeing it through to completion, if we don't have kind of a structure, or this isn't for everyone, but I think a lot of ADHDers, like if you don't have a structure in place to kind of step you through how to get that done in a way that doesn't completely overwhelm you and challenge against that initiation thing we talked about earlier, it can be really hard.
Totally. And I think that's why there are so many frameworks and structures for doing work when it comes to the like design, development, digital industries, because there are so many people with ADHD that everyone has created these methods of making work easier. And in true ADHD fashion, I've just forgotten what I was going to say in the middle of a sentence.
I love it. That's amazing. No, look, I mean, so one of the things I was going to ask you, Annie, was how do you think, because your background in digital is in like project management, kind of delivery, wizarding, things I try desperately to understand, but how's that manifested for you? And I mean, how did you see that play out in your team?
Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind is probably a negative thing rather than a strength. But I didn't realize that my strengths were something that was unusual. And especially when I was first transitioning into a leadership position, I had these expectations of people in my team to just be able to perform in the way that I was performing, using, the same spectrum of experiences that I was expecting. And I know that caused a lot of anxiety for some of the people in my team, because I had really high standards, because I thought that they could all do the things and see the things and connect the things in the same way, and not everyone could do that. And I think that made me feel quite sad when I kind of came to the realization that my ADHD was, the byproduct of that was causing pressure on people around me. Like even just things like leaving things to the last minute. And I know we've worked together and we've done that together. Like those things can cause frustrations, but in the same method, having to manage people who have ADHD and having to come up with all of these techniques to make things work together better has kind of like helped all aspects of my life. Like Kanban boards, useful in and outside of work.
Well, in the comments, I could see Juan mentioned that, breaking a big task into little tasks.
Absolutely. I have a book which is called Thriving with Adult ADHD. It's written by a psychologist who works with people in Silicon Valley, and it's just full. It's such a good book. It's full of like tips on like how to get work done across all of those different aspects of executive functioning. So how to like put practices or scaffolds in place to make that easier for yourself. And I read the book and I was like, we naturally do 80% of this stuff in digital. So all those things like breaking things down, making it as small as possible, making things visual. Because if it's, hidden in a Confluence page or a PowerPoint, no one's going to remember it. doing things like, taking actions and putting them in a shared place. Like it's just so much of it we have just automatically done without even realizing that those things were things that helped people with ADHD.
Yeah, and like agile, the agile sort of project management methodology and the heart of agile, which we're both a big fan of. If you haven't looked into it, the heart of agile will like absolutely change your life. So I know someone had asked about, can you share some of the structures for execution? Check out agile, check out Kanban, which is one of the sort of sub methodologies in agile. And it's not just the board, there's more to Kanban than just the Trello board vibe. But yeah, I think kind of looking into different systems and trying different things, and we'll go into more detail in a sec.
To answer your question, 5, yes, that is the book. All right, so we're going to talk about how to support people in the workplace. So I think that's, really the most important thing about this. And this is not just really for managers, but also for people working with other people in their teams and also for yourselves. So there is a framework. Thank you to How to ADHD if you haven't seen their channel. But I did add an extra F in there because I like to focus on strengths. But I think it's really important if you do have people in your team who are ADHD, or even for yourself, like learn about what is ADHD. There are a lot of people who have been diagnosed ADHD in childhood and forgotten. Like I have friends who when I got my diagnosis, started talking about it with them. And they're like, oh yeah, I was diagnosed when I was like 9. I forgot.
Yeah. And actually for me, when I went into the diagnosis process, my intention was like, I had a bit of internalized ableism where I was like, oh, I don't want the meds. But my motivation for getting diagnosed was I wanted to understand myself better. I wanted to learn about systems and tools and things that I could do to help things not feel so hard. Yeah. So, the positive of that approach, I mean, I'm now on meds and I love meds, and thank gosh for meds. I'm very lucky that they work for me. But a lot of the really positive early momentum I got like prior to my diagnosis.
You've got on mute, I think.
Brain works. It's a chemical thing.
Sorry, you just cut out for.
Oh yeah, I think my internet's being a bit of a poo today, so there we go. But yeah, it was learning about all the different kind of ways that my symptoms, manifest, and understanding them better was kind of the first way, like being able to identify, oh yeah, so I interrupt people a lot. That's kind of actually a way that I fidget. Like that's a way of my distraction and attention, trying to kind of get that dopamine hit. And so that understanding and learning about your ADHD, it sounds kind of boring sometimes. I kind of found it a bit boring. You were quite interested in it, weren't you, Annie?
In which part?
When you first got your ADHD diagnosis, like you went real deep into the knowledge rabbit hole?
Not as deep as I did for autism. But I'm actually training to get a certification in ADHD life coaching at the moment. And I have spent the last couple of months learning everything about ADHD, from medication to statistics to how it affects people throughout their lifespan. So yes, I'm definitely going deep now. But what I love about this LIFT framework is when I reflect back on how we have kind of like optimized our work relationship, which has then turned into like a really amazing friendship, is we were actually doing these things every day together, which I think is really awesome. Now we've only got 20 minutes left, so I think we should touch on this because you want to talk to the slide?
Yeah, look, Annie and I had a wonderful little neurodivergent moment of trying to figure out how to visualize this, and we were like, well, at least if it's just all on one slide, people can screen grab it, and we'll just touch on some of this stuff, and if people can have questions, they can ask questions. But like, I think the thing that's sort of the root of this is there's so many different ways to better support your ADHD, right? Like you get the awesome strengths, you get the challenges, and what matters the most is that is different for everyone. There's like no one type of this, and so it's really important for you to understand how your ADHD presents, and then try lots of different ways to work with it. It's less about trying to stop the things that are difficult and figure out like, what do you want to focus on? What do you want to move towards?
Yeah, so I think, there's lots of things around like time management. Probably some people on the call have heard of eat the frog, where there's a technique where you're supposed to try and do the hardest thing first. I used to tell people to do that, and now I'm like, no, I mean, you can try it if you want, but I don't think that works for ADHD brains. For me to get started, I need to have some small, quick wins. Even if it's just as simple as like cleaning my desk before I get started, organizing some things, or just like quickly looking at my Slack messages and feeling like I've done the thing, or whatever that is, before I get into the really hard stuff. And also acknowledging that I feel the most creative in the afternoon. My mornings, my brain's not really on.
It's always helpful because I'm definitely more of a morning person. So when we collaborate, it can be a bit of a struggle kind of juggling those two needs, but we usually figure it out.
Yeah. And I think the most important thing on here for me, if you are ADHD, is probably focusing on your strengths. Going back to that point around, the 20,000 pieces of negative feedback, it's so easy to focus on all of these challenges, deficits, without realizing that, we have some incredible strengths and we need to be reminded of them.
Like, speaking to that, I think there's something really interesting there, which is like, I remember before my diagnosis when I was really having trouble managing lots of projects at work and stuff, and I would make a Kanban and that would work for a couple of weeks and then it would stop working. And then I'd be like, okay, maybe Kanban's not right for me. And so then I would make a to-do list and I would try that, and then that wouldn't work. And then I would like find some Todoist app or something on the internet, and that would work for a few weeks and then wouldn't work. And I really fought against that. I was like, what the fuck? Like, and this was like actually one of the hardest period, because I'm like, why? I've tried so many things. Like, why does it work and then stop? What is wrong with me? And that was where I got into some really difficult, like, dark headspaces. But then I kind of was like, what if I flipped this around? Right? I was learning about experimentation at the time with a colleague of mine, and he's also ADHD, and he sort of, we're talking about it in context of our clients and running low fidelity and high fidelity experimentation and optimization. And then I was like, what if I just thought about my whole life as that? And that was such a big shift for me, and like, so now when I'm like, okay, I want to do a thing, I'm going to try, a Kanban, and that will work for a few weeks. And when I notice that stops working, I'll be like, oh, okay, my brain's sick of Kanban. I need to go on to the next tool. And I kind of just have this little bunch of tools now that I cycle through. And as my brain gets bored and it's no longer novel, I just find a new one or go back to an old one. I've tried Pomodoro. I've tried fucking everything.
Yeah. Well, we have novelty. We are novelty seekers, and we get bored easily.
Sometimes the best way to get your to-do list done or to get it cleaned up is to redo it.
100%. I have a whiteboard that has a structure, and probably once a month I wipe the whole thing off and completely redo the structure, because my brain gets used to looking at things, and if I don't like move them around, then they'll never get done.
Yeah, the interaction's a big part of it, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. And on the right hand side around, how to better manage ADHD team members, what I think is really important is to not see weaknesses as a moral failure. And again, kind of playing to the strengths.
I think one of the things for me as a people leader that I think is really important is, like, when I was kind of going through how to be a manager of people, there's a lot of kind of methodologies and all that kind of thing. And the thing that I've never loved is this idea of, there's a sort of a roughly a few set ways that you can manage people and you need to stick to that. I really, in the last few years, I actually think that's a very ableist way to look at managing others. And it's a very self-centered way. Like, I remember like a lot of leaders over my career saying, well, if that person really wants a one-on-one, they'll set up time with me. And I actually realized what was going on there. That was, if you didn't set up that time for them, or if they didn't set up the time for you, often the reason they didn't set up the time was, firstly, they didn't want to inconvenience you and they thought you were busy and didn't want to take your time, or they'd forgotten, or you'd said to them, set up time with me if you need help, and they hadn't identified they need help.
Yeah.
So what I do with all my team members now is I set up time with everyone, like every 2 to 3 weeks. And sometimes we sit down and we just have a chat about random stuff. But more often than not, we'll sit down, we'll start having a chat, and we're like, oh, that's interesting. How are you going with that? And then just through conversing about, you know, what they're working on and looking for kind of challenges, or even just looking for like micro expressions where I can see something's not sitting right, we can often unpack something and then we collaborate, you know, visually in a Miro board. My team will joke that I like pretty much just Miro as like an extension of my body and my brain. But, you know, I just love playing to that visual strength that a lot of my team members have, and they find it really effective.
I think another one on this list is around helping your teams to actively avoid burnout. So it's really, really common for ADHDers to burn out. And it's also really common for us to be people pleasers, to not be very good at setting boundaries, to also have difficulties with prioritization and time management. And this all creates like some sort of tornado. And kind of going off what you said before, like I think it's really common for managers to be like, well, if they needed help, they'd just speak up. Or if they can't do the work, then that's a them problem, rather than that's actually probably an organizational problem. And, you know, I've had people in my team before where I've had to say to them, like, are you okay? And also, I really think you need to take 2 weeks off, like ASAP. Like, you need to not be here, because this is not going to end well, and I want you to be healthy and well.
Yeah, I've come up with a really good technique for helping my team members who are working late, because, you know, you tell people, hey, don't work late, and they'll be like, oh, but I've got these things done and there's all this pressure, and I used to try all these different things that just didn't work. So the best technique I've found is I would say to my team member, okay, team member, you need to set an alarm every work day in your phone for 6 p.m. And you can work past 6 p.m. I don't care if you work past 6 p.m., but at 6 p.m., if you are going to work past 6 p.m., you have to text message me and tell me why. And then we will figure out what you can push back or what you need to change so that you can build the self-awareness. And it's quite, I've found the technique, I've used it a couple of times, and usually within 1 to 2 weeks, we've eliminated that person working overtime by just teaching them in the moment, here's when you need to push back. Here's when you know, maybe in that moment where someone's asking you to do a thing, don't say yes immediately. Just say, oh, let me go have a look at my schedule. Let me see what I've got on my plate. And can I get back to you later today? And just by putting that time in, you know, to pause, we reduce that kind of, you know, that compulsion from all that trauma and RSD of wanting to please people that is built up over our lifetime. But putting that space in, we can make time to just go, oh, I really want to help you. Let me make sure I can do that. So it's still a positive framing. And then you can kind of go, okay, cool. Do I actually have capacity? If not, can I come back and say, I'd love to help you. It'll have to be in 2 weeks' time, you know, or you might, here's some other people that might be able to assist.
Yeah. Now I know we've only got 10 minutes left, and we really could be talking about this for a long time, but so we'll take questions now. And there was a question from Lauren. Will we get a chance to hear about strategies and tips for working with and managing people with ADHD? So some things specifically that I have found really helpful is strong encouragement of getting people to block out their lunch breaks to make sure that they eat on time every day and they get away from their desk. It's very, very common for people to not do that, and then they don't realize until the end of the day they actually feel really horrible. They haven't eaten, they haven't had enough water, because we do forget to do those things. Encouraging people or teaching people how to set boundaries. So if someone books a meeting in your calendar and you're like, it's going to stress you out, you don't have to say yes. Like, it's your calendar and your time, and teaching people how to push back, how to offer solutions, and, you know, how to work with that person to find the right way to deal with that. What else have you found there, Julia?
So Annie, I've been desperately trying to copy paste the questions as they've been coming through this session. And so I've got a couple for us. So I'm going to kind of just basically interview you now with these questions. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Love it. So how do you deal with people who treat ADHD symptoms, such as being forgetful, that are out of our control? So sorry, I'm just going to read. How do you deal with people who treat ADHD symptoms as intentional character flaws? There we go.
How do you treat the person, or how do you deal with that person?
How do you deal with people?
Right.
So my presumption, and Lauren, you might want to clarify, but my presumption was, how do you deal with people who are assuming that it's behavioral, basically?
I mean, look, that is not an easy question to answer, but I do think that the first step is understanding. And sometimes it's not fun to have that conversation. This is why I think all organizations need neurodiversity training, because it is, a common misunderstanding that people who are late, people who are forgetful, people who leave things to the last minute, that they are bad workers. But actually, they probably just have ADHD and don't have the right supports in place to harness their strengths at work.
Yeah. So I've got another one. Is there a slide for if you think you might be managed by an ADHD manager? So do you want to just talk a little bit about ADHD managers and, diagnosis versus not diagnosed and that kind of thing?
It's a really interesting question. I myself have definitely had undiagnosed ADHD managers, because that's why they hired me in the first place, because they subconsciously could tell that we had similar brain types. And it's very common for those ADHD managers to have a lot of ideas, to maybe not finish a lot of things, to not write things down, and to live in chaos. And I think you've got to have a good relationship with your manager to be able to overcome some of these things. And, and here we talk about radical candor and the SBII feedback framework, situation, behavior, impact, and intent. But really it's got to be about opening up a dialogue, and then also seeing how you can play each other's strengths together. So I used to, kind of make a joke about one of my previous managers. They were the ideas machines and I was the implementer. And that kind of worked hand in hand. There's a question that I wanted to ask you, which was, how does ADHD fit into your design process? Do you have to do things differently?
I guess there's a hard part of that question in that I don't know how everyone else does it. And so I guess maybe, however, the things I try to be mindful of with my ADHD is one of the ways my ADHD presents is perfectionism, the effort thing. I love doing a good job because I love getting a pat on the head and someone telling me I'm amazing, but I take that to the extreme. So anyone who's ever worked with me will know my cultish mantra, which is progress over perfection. And that's been such a positive life framing for me, in that, I want to strive for perfection, but it's okay. I'm never going to get there because it's an illusion. And so the best thing for me to do is to kind of just focus on doing the best I can in a reasonable time frame, and kind of really identifying when I'm going too far and over perfecting and getting worried about things that can either be fixed up later or aren't probably as big a deal to me to others as they are to me. Yeah. And the other thing is really, it's that incremental stuff. So, a few people mentioned earlier about Kanban, and we talked about agile, that mindset of chunking things down, into tiny little tasks has been life-changing for me. So I'll be well, all I want to do this morning is just figure out who my research profile is, and I'll just time box kind of 30 minutes to dot point that out. And then I'll be okay, cool. Next thing is to write the interview question. So as opposed to just going prep research, which could have 10 tasks under it, it's breaking it down into little manageable chunks, which I can then satisfyingly tick off and be fuck yeah, I did a thing. Yeah. So yeah.
Got to get that dopamine there.
So Annie, a question from the chat. Can medication or exercise help during the day with ADHD?
I think that says meditation. I think you said medication. But all of those things help. So yes. So exercise helps to increase blood flow in the prefrontal cortex, which is where we lack blood flow. And it also increases dopamine. So exercise is one of the best things that ADHDers can do for their brains. Whether it's...
Sorry, you go, Annie.
I was going to say, whether it is going for a walk, doing like lifting weights, or, you know, doing yoga, whatever, having a dance around your apartment, whatever that thing is that's going to get your kind of your blood flow going, is going to really help with things like focus and attention.
Yeah. And so if any of you are like me and you have lived experience of disordered eating, I won't go into that in any more detail for the sake of like content and stress and all that kind of thing. But I frame that as movement. So I don't use the word exercise anymore. Different people have different perspectives on that. But for me, it's just about moving my body in pleasurable ways. So some days that's sitting on my deck in the sun. Some days that's going for a walk to look at the flowers. Some days that's going for a hike with my wife or my friends, or, you know, whatever. Some days it's going to the zoo. I worked from the zoo once, just because I thought it'd be really interesting to see if I could work at the zoo. And it was actually a really productive day. Like I would just hyper focus for a bit and then go look at some like tapirs being cute as hell. So, yeah, you know, whatever works for you, I think is, you know, using your body in ways that generate good vibes for you.
Yeah. And I think with meditation, particularly mindfulness rather than maybe meditation as a concept, anything that you can do, because, you know, there's a lot of neurotypical meditation, which is all about clear the mind. Well, if you've got ADHD, you're not going to be clearing your mind. So don't try, because you'll feel like a failure if you can't do it. So I like to practice mindfulness instead, which could be doing things like body scanning. If you don't know what that is, do a little Google, and doing metacognition. So observing my thoughts and thinking about my thoughts, and then deciding how I'm going to action those thoughts. And then doing like mindful activities, whether it's some of the things you just mentioned, like looking at some animals or knitting or painting, or something where you get to focus on like a small thing, can be really mindful for ADHDers.
Jigsaw puzzles and murder podcasts were my favorite when I had a bit of a burnout period at the start of the year. Man, I got real into jigsaw puzzles. There was a Reddit forum involved. It was hardcore. So I'm just going to answer a tactical question. Will there be slides? Yes, we will share the slides later. Annie, I really wanted to get to this one. You know, it's a personal fave of mine. Is there a correlation between finding it hard to go to bed on time and ADHD?
So it's actually really surprising that sleep issues is not in the DSM relating to ADHD. It is one of the most common traits that ADHDers share. So often it can be either that you stay up too late, you know that you should go to bed at 10, but you actually go to bed at 12:30, or struggling to get up in the morning, or having restless sleep during the night. Any sort of sleep challenges is something that ADHDers commonly experience.
And actually on that one, right, because the sleep one is a really tough one for us, because sleep has such a big impact on everything else. So, you know, it's something I've literally spent years with my multiple therapists working on. And the best thing for me that actually worked, and this is probably like, it comes back to some of the key points we've touched on earlier, is I kind of had this view in my mind for a while that I needed to be good at sleep. Like a successful outcome would be if I didn't go to bed late. And my most recent therapist said to me, like, Julia, what if we just accepted that you're going to have some nights where you stay up until 2, 3, 4 a.m., whatever. If that's just a thing that happens, but we roughly speaking, we want to trend towards self-care and like, you know, getting to bed on time, and it's focusing on the positive outcomes you want to get to, which is looking after your body, allowing your brain to rest. Like, you know, it comes from a self-care perspective. And if you have a bad night where you stay up late, wake up the next morning and say, okay, that happened. That's okay. Tomorrow, today will be better. And just that simple mindset shift for me, simple mindset shift for me had such a fundamental impact on how I approached going to bed. You know, so I try really hard. I know the advice we always get is don't be on devices. Look, I do still get on devices sometimes, but I try really hard to kind of stop after about 9 o'clock. And I literally have just hyper focused this week in buying like a shit ton of like puzzle books. So I'll just sit in bed and listen to like relaxation music and do like written puzzles. So not on a device, because the blue light's going to fuck with you. I sit there with a friction pen in bed, like doing doing crosswords or doing Sudoku or whatever. And that's actually been working really well for me. It may only last for the next 3 weeks, who knows? But again, just keep experimenting, keep seeing what works for you, and really focus on the kind of life you want to get to, rather than beating yourself up for what's happened in the past. Like, don't perpetuate all that crap. Do your best to be like, I'm a good human. I have lots of strengths. I have lots of awesome things I bring to an organization and my friends and my family. And the challenges I have are okay. I'm okay. And I'm going to focus on working towards the things I want to improve that are helpful for me to be the version of me I want to be.
Now, I can see that we're already over time in true ADHD fashion. There is just so much to talk about when it comes to ADHD, working with ADHDers, being an ADHDer in digital. So if you're interested in more information, feel free to post questions in the chat. We will either try and answer you, or maybe we'll stick around for 5 more minutes after this. But if you are interested in finding out more help around how to be your best self at work, whether you are a designer or not a designer, feel free to take a little photo of the fancy QR code that Julia has made, and you can book a session with us to talk about how something like coaching might be helpful for you. Danica is saying, please 5 more minutes.
I'm fine with 5 more minutes.
I'm fine with 5 more minutes.
So for those of you that need to run off, just really massive thanks, honestly, for coming along. For us, like, we just really wanted to kind of give back a little bit to our peeps, to celebrate ADHD Awareness Month. Like, our brains are awesome. So just make sure you celebrate the goodness, focus on where you want to go. Look at that, that's my timer saying, Julia, you need to stop talking. How perfectly timed is that?
Perfectly timed.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. And for those of you that want to hang around, do hang around, and we'll carry on a bit of a chat. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us through these things on the screen. Cool. So Annie, do you want me to keep reading through some questions?
Go for it.
Cool. Okay. Can you do the express version of how do you get diagnosed as an adult?
Okay, so step 1 is you need to get a referral from your GP. Getting a referral from your GP may be difficult, especially if you are, and I don't like this term, high functioning or considered successful. Often, a lot of GPs will just say, no, you don't need it, you're fine.
You're too successful to be ADHD.
Exactly. So there are some self report tools that you can go and have a look at online. I will find a link to a good one and I'll share it in an email after the session. But I would take that to self-advocate for yourself. Then you need to get a referral for a psychiatrist. You can get diagnosed by psychologists in Australia, but they can't diagnose, they can't prescribe medication. And yeah, the process, it's long and it is quite expensive. So I think mine cost me about $1,000, not ideal. And it took at least 9 months to get in with a psychiatrist once I got my referral. So if you have been thinking, do I have ADHD? Maybe I've got ADHD. If you have a referral already, but you haven't acted on it, write it on your task list, because it's going to be a long wait once you finally get an appointment. So the sooner you get in, the sooner you can get that crossed off.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. So we've got that one. Oh, I've covered that one. Oh, look, actually, I think we've covered all of the questions I'd copied down, but there's probably more in the chat. But yeah. I'm also happy if people have a question and they want to just use the raise hand feature and we can kind of triage it that way. Are you happy with that, Annie?
Yeah, it's fine. Oh. Sorry, just to Danica's question. Yes, there is discussion around changing the rules around whether or not GPs can diagnose ADHD. That, as far as I'm aware, has not been implemented just yet. So yes, watch this space, I guess.
Any other questions that people had they wanted to throw us? I know they would have been in the chat, and I'm just scrolling through now.
There's a good one here. Do you have a way to differentiate between autism and ADHD? Yes. So the main things that autism has that ADHD doesn't is sensory sensitivities or hyposensitivities, where, you know, things like not being able to feel pain or being really sensitive to noise, sunlight, like not liking certain textures like mushy bananas or microfiber towels or velvet, like feeling like sick. Like I feel physically ill in my stomach if I touch microfiber. And also having communication challenges. And when I say communication challenges, a lot of people, especially if they have high intelligence, will be very good at masking those communication challenges. So it's very common for autistic people to have resting bitch face, or to have a flat, monotonous tone. Like even the voice I'm putting on right now, this is not my real voice. My real voice is like this. This is me completely unmasked. And when I unmask, people find me intimidating. So I put on a fake voice so people think I'm a nicer person. And, you know, things like people saying that you're overly direct or that you're blunt. Those are things that are traditionally associated with autism. ADHD is more around those executive functions. So working memory. So that's, you know, short-term memory, prioritization, time management, daydreaming, things like that.
So Annie, I've got a couple more questions. A really good one from Danica. How do you discuss ADHD within the workplace, especially to managers if there isn't ND, neurodiversity training implemented?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. It depends whether or not you're diagnosed or not. Sometimes it's great to have an advocate to maybe help you navigate some of those conversations. That's where coaching can be really helpful. And yeah, like it is a rough process to kind of navigate because many managers are unaware and will say things like, oh, you don't seem like you have ADHD, or, oh, that explains things. Oh, don't like that. So yeah, I would say probably trying to get some support, finding some references of, you know, like how to have those conversations, which is definitely something that I want to write because not a lot of the stuff exists so far.
Can you say more about doom piles? I don't have anything to say about doom piles. Do you, Annie? No problem with doom piles?
I have one doom pile that I allow myself to have. It is a box. It is a crate that sits in my room, and anything that I can't be bothered organizing or filing away just goes in there, and then maybe once a year I'll organize it or chuck it all away. My mum, however, has doom piles throughout the house. It's actually really common. It's not listed in that iceberg as co-occurring conditions, but hoarding disorder is very common in people with ADHD.
Yeah, I have about 3 doom piles to my immediate left that none of you can see. One of which is significantly made up of BTS cards, because I'm really obsessed with BTS and want to redo my BTS shrine, and I've been meaning to do that for a week. So yeah, armies. Hey, armies. So yeah, I'm known for my doom piles. My wife and I both have them. She's autistic, and we both love a doom pile. So yeah, they're really great little, if you've got lots of piles of things in your house that you've been meaning to organize but haven't organized, that's what we're talking about with doom piles. Sometimes they're paperwork, sometimes they're things you've got to put somewhere, you haven't figured out where to put them yet, and you don't want to put them in the wrong place or something.
Perfectionism will stop you from organizing it.
It's infuriating.
Yeah. Look, it's already 10 past, so unfortunately we probably need to call it there because we could literally talk for hours on this. So I just want to again thank everyone for joining. And yes, if you want to reach out to either of us, you can reach out on LinkedIn, you can book a free session with us. And also, Julia, you wanted to plug that you've got some roles that you're hiring for.
Oh yeah, I did. So working at Maya at the moment, And we're looking for designers and human-centered designers, UX, UI, service designers, and also product owners. So if you are one of those roles and you're looking for a new fit with a team that is doing a lot of work on culture change and employee engagement and all that kind of thing, hit me up on LinkedIn, and I'd love to chat to you and hear more about what you're looking for, and see if it's a good fit for both of us. So that's it. But thanks so much for coming along, everyone, and thanks for the amazing engagement in the chat. Like, I think this is like the most engaged chat I've ever seen, ever. So that's really nice. We appreciate your enthusiasm. Yeah, but have a great day. Take care of yourselves. Celebrate the wins, and go forth at ADHD.
Thank you.